The steel hulls rested in long rows along the harbor, silent, motionless. The water beneath them no longer carried the tension of war patrols or the hum of diesel engines pushing through enemy waters. These were the submarines that had strangled Japan's supply lines, that had prowled the Pacific hunting convoys, that had returned to port with brooms tied to their periscopes, signaling clean sweeps. Now they sat empty, tied to piers that stretched farther than the eye could see, their hatches open to the salt air, their batteries drained, their torpedo tubes hollow. It was September 1945, and the war was over. But what do you do with 300 submarines when peace arrives? In the days after Japan's surrender, the men who had lived inside those cramped steel tubes began stepping onto dry land for the last time as combat submariners. They left behind bunks, still warm, charts still pinned to navigation tables, coffee mugs unwashed in the galley. The transition from war to peace was not a ceremony. It was a slow draining of purpose. Crews were reassigned, transferred, discharged. By late autumn, most of the submarines that had fought across the Pacific were manned only by skeleton maintenance teams, if they were manned at all. The submarine force that had entered the war with fewer than 70 boats had grown into a fleet of nearly 300 vessels by war's end. They had sunk more than 5 million tons of Japanese shipping. They had rescued downed pilots, inserted special forces, severed supply routes, and turned the Pacific into a graveyard for enemy merchant fleets. But victory had made them obsolete almost immediately. The Navy faced a logistical problem without precedent. 300 submarines required berthing, maintenance, security and funding. Crews required pay and housing. Spare parts required storage. Fuel required delivery. And all of this had to be managed in a nation that was rapidly demobilizing, that wanted its sons and husbands home, that was cutting military budgets with the same speed it had once expanded them. By the end of 1945, decisions were already being made in Washington. Not all of these submarines would continue serving. Not all of them could. Some were already too old, their hulls weakened by years of depth charging and emergency dives. Others were too slow, relics of an earlier generation of design. Still others were simply redundant. The Navy did not need 300 submarines in peacetime, so the sorting began. The first submarines to go were the oldest. The S-boats, designs from the 1920s, were pulled from active service almost immediately. They had fought bravely in the early days of the war, when nothing else was available, but they were cramped, slow, and mechanically unreliable. By early 1946, most had been towed to shipbreaking yards along the East Coast, where cutting torches reduced their steel frames to scrap metal. The men who had served on them rarely spoke of it. There was no ceremony for obsolescence. The fleet-type submarines, the workhorses of the Pacific campaign, faced a more varied fate. Some were retained for active duty, their crews maintained, their batteries charged, their engines kept in working order. These boats continued patrols, though now the enemy was hypothetical. The Cold War had not yet been named, but tensions with the Soviet Union were already visible on the horizon. Submarines that had hunted Japanese destroyers now tracked Soviet shipping movements, monitored naval exercises, tested new sonar technologies. Others were placed in what the Navy called reserve status. This meant they were decommissioned but not destroyed. Their batteries were removed. Their fuel tanks were drained. Preservative grease was applied to machinery. Hatches were sealed. They were towed to isolated anchorages and moored in long rows, waiting for a future conflict that might never come. These reserve fleets, sometimes called mothball fleets, stretched across harbors in California, Washington, and the East Coast. From the air, they looked like geometric patterns on the water, perfectly aligned rows of gray steel fading slowly under the sun. A third group was designated for experimentation. The rapid advancement of technology during the war had left many questions unanswered. What would happen to a submarine struck by an atomic blast? How effective were new sonar systems against different hull designs? Could older submarines be retrofitted with newer propulsion systems? The Navy needed answers, and decommissioned submarines provided them. Some were subjected to weapons tests. Others became floating laboratories. A few were deliberately sunk to study underwater salvage techniques. And then there were the submarines that were simply given away. Under the terms of various post-war agreements, the United States transferred dozens of submarines to Allied nations. Britain received several, so did France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and several Latin American countries. These transfers served multiple purposes. They strengthened alliances, they provided training platforms for Allied navies, and they removed the burden of maintenance from American shipyards. For the nations receiving them, these submarines represented a sudden leap in capability. A country that had never operated a submarine force could now field a small fleet of battle-tested vessels. Crews were trained by American instructors, manuals were translated, spare parts were shipped. By the early 1950s, former American submarines were patrolling waters from the Mediterranean to the coast of South America, their hulls repainted, their flags changed, their identities transformed. But this generosity had limits. The submarines transferred were older models, sometimes stripped of their most advanced equipment before handover. Sonar systems were downgraded, encryption devices were removed, fire control computers were replaced with simpler versions. The United States was willing to share steel and diesel engines, but not the cutting edge of naval technology. Back home, the submarines that remained in American hands began to change in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the men who had fought the war. The first experiments with snorkel technology, borrowed from captured German U-boats, allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged just below the surface. This extended underwater endurance dramatically. Submarines that once had to surface every few hours to recharge batteries could now remain hidden for days. Then came the more radical transformations. In 1946, the Navy launched a program called GUPPY, an acronym for Greater Underwater Propulsion Power. The idea was to take existing fleet submarines and rebuild them from the inside out. Hulls were streamlined, superstructures were reduced, deck guns were removed, additional batteries were installed. The goal was speed and endurance underwater, not surface performance. The GUPPY conversions turned submarines designed for surface transit into true underwater vessels. The transformation was dramatic. A standard fleet submarine could manage perhaps 9 knots submerged for an hour before exhausting its batteries. A GUPPY submarine could exceed 15 knots and remain underwater far longer. The silhouette changed too. Where the original fleet boats had looked industrial, bristling with antennas and deck equipment, the GUPPY conversions were sleek, almost organic in shape. But even as these modifications were underway, the future of submarine warfare was being written in an entirely different direction. Nuclear propulsion, the possibility of a submarine that never needed to surface, that could remain submerged for months, that could cross oceans without refueling, was no longer theoretical. Scientists and engineers were already working on the reactor designs that would power the first true underwater warship. The diesel submarines, no matter how upgraded, were already becoming relics. By the early 1950s, the fate of most of America's World War II submarines was sealed. The active fleet had shrunk dramatically. Reserve submarines continued to rust in their anchorages, visited occasionally by maintenance crews who checked moorings and pumped out accumulated water. A handful remained in service with Allied navies. Others had been scrapped, their steel recycled into bridges, buildings, automobiles. Some met stranger ends. One submarine was deliberately sunk off the coast of California to serve as an artificial reef. Another was converted into a floating power generator for a remote Alaskan village. A few were sold to private buyers and transformed into tourist attractions, restaurants or museum pieces. One enterprising buyer attempted to convert a surplus submarine into a luxury yacht, though the project was eventually abandoned due to impracticality. The men who had served on these boats moved on as well. They returned to farms, factories, universities, offices. Some remained in the Navy, transitioning to the new nuclear submarine force. Others left the service entirely. When they gathered at reunions in later years, they spoke of specific patrols, specific moments, specific shipmates. They did not speak much about what happened to the boats themselves. The submarines had been tools, vital and irreplaceable during the war. But tools nonetheless. When the war ended, so did their relevance. There were exceptions. A few submarines were preserved as memorials: the USS Baufin in Hawaii, the USS Pampanito in San Francisco, the USS Code in Cleveland. These vessels were maintained by veteran organizations and historical societies, open to the public, their interiors restored to something approximating wartime configuration. Visitors could walk through the narrow passageways, peer into the tiny bunks, stand in the control room where depth and course had been decided under fire. But even these memorials represented only a fraction of the fleet. For every submarine preserved, dozens were reduced to scrap. The true surprise came decades later, when historians and archaeologists began locating the submarines that had been scuttled or lost in the post-war period. Some had been deliberately sunk in deep water as part of weapons testing. Others had been scuttled when it became clear no one wanted them, and storage costs were too high. A few had been lost in training accidents during the transition to peacetime operations. These wrecks, when discovered, told stories their crews never intended: intact torpedo tubes, spare parts still stored in compartments, personal items left behind during hasty decommissioning. One submarine found off the coast of Florida still had charts in the navigation room, dated to late 1945, showing planned patrol routes that would never be followed. The ocean had become the final resting place for much of the submarine force that had won the Pacific War. Not through combat, not through ceremony, but through quiet, bureaucratic decisions made in the years when the nation was focused on rebuilding, not remembering. What happened to America's submarines after World War II was not a single story. It was hundreds of stories, each hull taking a different path. Some served for decades under foreign flags. Others were reduced to razor blades and rebar within months of the war's end. A few became museums, many became memories. But beneath all these individual fates was a larger pattern. The submarines that had been essential, irreplaceable, the tip of the spear in the Pacific campaign, became surplus almost immediately. Their victory made them unnecessary. Peace is not kinder to warships than combat. It simply moves slower. The last of the World War II diesel submarines in American service was retired in the early 1970s, nearly 3 decades after the war ended. By then, nuclear-powered submarines had been patrolling the oceans for years, vessels so advanced that the diesel boats seemed primitive by comparison. The connection between the submarines that fought in the Pacific and the submarines that would define the Cold War was more philosophical than mechanical. They were different tools for different eras, but the pattern would repeat. When the Cold War ended, the nuclear submarines that had prowled the depths for decades faced their own moment of obsolescence. New technologies, new threats, new budgets. The story of what happens after the fighting stops is never really about the weapons themselves. It is about the difficulty of letting go, the cost of storage, the calculus of preservation versus practicality. And so the steel hulls that once patrolled the Pacific in long aggressive sweeps, that survived depth charges and torpedoes and mechanical failures, ended their service in quieter ways. Sold, scrapped, scuttled, preserved, forgotten. The ocean kept some, museums kept a few, memory kept the rest. But memory fades faster than steel corrodes. The war had ended. The submarines, in one way or another, followed.